My first, I guess, seminar with INET, and I'm delighted to be here today. Actually, this kind of the impetus of this started really after Eric and I have had discussions for me to discuss my participation and thoughts of COP29 after the COP, but then it was in the lead up to Christmas and also thinking what would be a better idea to kind of really take some time and reflect on what's happening. It was better to kind of think of this as more of a later stage international climate policy briefing, looking at where we are and what next after COP29. I have to say that since I moved to the UK, I realized that every day in the UK is climate briefing day. We always ask, how's the weather here? So what I'll be kind of talking to today, really kind of a snapshot of where we are and obviously in the direction of where we're heading. And I also want to acknowledge also my membership at the Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions at the ANU, because also I went to COP as part of their delegation work with their accreditation as well. Interestingly, so this is kind of the agenda of what I'll be talking about today. So I'll just give you a very brief intro. We don't have we have a lot more audience online than in the room. Have any of you not been to COP? Okay, most of the people in the room, and I can see some of the names, and I know some of them have not online, and I know some of them have not been to COP. So I'll give a very, very brief intro, a bit of the COP process, and maybe put in context some of the things I'll be talking about before. But I then want to kind of just give you like really three main parts of the talk. So a snapshot, what happened at COP, what are the challenges looking in the future, and then finally solutions, way forward. And that will be what I'll be guiding today. But maybe I think maybe one of the best kind of anecdote to kind of put this in perspective is last night I was communicating with a colleague who is from a developing country, an advanced economy, working in a developing petrostate and a development fund, or a bank, I should say. He might be online. And the question he asked was, is climate change still a thing? Which is quite interesting. And my response was, yes, it is still a thing, but maybe mitigating is not. So I think that maybe gives you an idea of really where this talk might be heading. So let's start with we're going to move to just a brief introduction. Actually, before I go into the brief messages, so basically the COP process really is kind of like the big climate meeting of all the different parties that are signatory and members of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. They've been meeting for about almost 30 years now, and there have been few major meetings, if you will. One was in Kyoto in Japan, and the other one was also in the Netherlands, and then finally in Paris at COP15, where the Paris Climate Agreement was adopted. And then there's about 198, I believe, countries that are signatories to that. And then part of that is also the countries have committed to trying to limit the rise in global temperatures to about 1.5 degree above pre-industrial levels. And then really trying to kind of take different actions locally and globally to achieve that. And this is pretty much where then countries have been meeting annually in what is called as the Conference of the Parties, the COP. And then thank you very much. And those COP meetings then kind of have different large, either sometimes initiatives, sometimes big agreements, but it's kind of a big deal because it really is a place where finally we globally as a group committed or accepted that climate change is a problem that faces everyone. We all need to be part of the solution or find a solution. So the 29th COP took place in Baku, Azerbaijan, last year in November. And I will be part of the talk that I'll be giving you today is based on my participation in that COP, but also some previous insights from previous COPs and previous research that I've done, as well as a forthcoming piece that I'll be hopefully sharing with you soon, which includes a lot of insights in the analysis here. So this is the key message that I'll be basically giving you through this talk. I think there's been quite a bit of achievement that is improving from the last COP, the previous COP, the 28th meeting, which happened in Dubai. But some have said this is a success, some have said it's not. I think it is indeed an improvement and a progress, but it is not enough. And at the same time, there's been really, I think, momentum, whether it's from companies, whether it's from civil society organizations, including issues like gender and health in the climate agenda. There's really momentum for change. But I think if we look forward at what is happening globally, including, at a global geopolitical economic level, I think the outlook is really quite grim, despite the momentum. And therefore, I'll be proposing some maybe not inclusive, but important policy actions, I think, and solutions that will enable us to kind of go beyond the limitations that we have of the international climate policy regime towards trying to achieve not just really solutions for the climate, but solutions that can also be meaningful and effective, and most importantly, just for those involved. And there will be quite a bit of a focus on, not necessarily a focus on developing countries, but really trying to show you, at least here as we sit in the UK, the perspective of developing countries and how that comes into play both in the negotiations, but also in the outcomes. Okay, so let's go into the snapshot. Maybe the first snapshot to tell you is that we are, last year basically was the warmest year recorded so far in terms of temperatures. And this is from the WMO, and it shows you basically the movement of the temperature. We've reached over 1.55 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. So we're way above targets already. And it looks like, based on our emissions trajectory, we are unlikely to meet our target. So is 1.5 degrees dead? One could argue. However, the 1.5 degree goal, I should say. But if we drop it and say it is dead, then we're basically going to burn in hell, so to speak, as we are now. We need to kind of keep that target there anyway, so we can try to nonetheless achieve some policies and advancements towards that. Now I'll take you a little bit with really kind of just a very brief look into how COP inside looks like, and hopefully this will give you a little bit of context about some of the dynamics that I'll be talking about a little bit later. So this is kind of the entry of the COP, and as you see over there, this was in the arena in Baku. It says, I think, welcome to COP29. There are two major areas, one formal, where negotiations take place, one informal, that's open to the public. And maybe probably giving you a bit of an idea of what was kind of expected of the COP. This is the first COP where it was really quote unquote the presidency's troika. This was something that was adopted in the previous COP, that the incoming that the current presidency plus the previous and the incoming would work together. So the COP in 29, the presidency in Baku worked with the Emirati as well as which is from COP28, plus the new coming one, which is the Brazilian COP30 that will be taking place this year, to try to kind of work together in achieving this math. So it's this goal. So it's a little bit important to kind of understand what came from COP28 and then where are we heading as we go into COP30. The COPs usually, a lot of the negotiations on climate happen here, but also happen climate meetings in the middle between the big COPs, which tend to be in November, December time. The big one being the meetings, the climate meetings in Bonn in Germany in June, where also the areas, agenda items that will be discussed then are also really with less political and media attention. They're often discussed also at the COP. So the COP, as I said, the COP28 launched this troika, and what was the most important thing that came out of COP28, this is Dubai 2023, was really the conclusion of the first global stocktake. And basically, this is what was well known, kind of like taking a global stocktake of where we are in emissions, and then also looking at the main thing that were kind of the goals that came out, transitioning away from fossil fuels. This is the very first time that fossil fuels have been mentioned in COPs. In COP meetings, so this is obviously a big advancement that way, but also tripling renewable energy and doubling energy efficiency by 2030. And it was also agreed that there will be a just and orderly and equitable energy transition that will be achieved. So this is kind of the roadmap, so to speak, that COP29 had to follow as well. And because of this, really, this kind of built on the Just Transition Work Program that was operationalized in COP28, and I worked quite, I guess, closely with that, as I had the really the honor and the privilege of presenting to the ministers on COP28 on that. But also that kind of led into really the big COP29 being the finance COP. At COP28, they launched or operationalized the loss and damage fund at at that COP. And then because everything that's kind of like needed to achieve these goals really depends on finance, COP29 was dubbed the climate finance. So there are major expectations really here on COP29 in terms of what the finance adoptions will be. And then you see a lot of, as in the picture in the corner, a lot of examples kind of even in the COP arena kind of committing to finance. So I'll take you very briefly now, I'll kind of run quickly, hopefully, just how it kind of looks inside. So it's basically really a major building with different, this is a formal area or what's called as the blue zone, kind of trying to navigate your way through hallways and meeting rooms and trying to find negotiations. There are big meetings that can be open to the public. Here we see I thought it was apt to have the UK Prime Minister being shown on the screen as he was speaking, but also at the same time a schedule of long listed meetings that happen, and maybe this is too small for you to see, but there are meetings still taking place at 1940, at 7:40 p.m., and the list goes on. And those are more of the formal topics or meetings, and then they include basically big summit, a big. Also, it's a political display, of course, not only of the COP presidency, but of different leaders and government leaders, but also some other meetings and negotiations in the rooms. And this is an example of one of the rooms where these negotiations take place. In this example, in this picture, for example, you see there are pictures and screens displayed so that the person speaking is there, but also the text often discussed is on display for everyone. And this process, part of the challenge and the difficulty in it is it requires consensus. So everybody has to agree. So this text is basically being reviewed by everyone consistently and continuously, which is great in a way, but also, can you imagine, how difficult it would be to actually find consensus? There's also, as I said, continuation of the previous COPs. So this is actually me in the little blue thing over there in the picture. This is from the COP28 Just Transition Work Program when this was launched, and then this obviously this is just one of the initiatives that then continues on into the next COPs, but then other COPs can also have their own initiatives. And COP29, for example, had a peace and climate initiative that was launched for the first time as well. Then you also go into within the rooms and panels, and there are different so-called pavilions. So different countries and organizations can have pavilions. Some are displaying the terrible impacts of climate change on them. This is here an example on basically, if you can see it here in the corner, it basically says Save West Papua Now. So there's really awareness creation to try to generate funds, to try to mitigate climate change, particularly for the countries that are impacted. But then also countries then showcase some of their developments that they're bringing to solutions. This is an example of mangrove planting from the United Arab Emirates Pavilion. This is also an example of material for construction from the Nordics Sustainable Construction Pavilion, very creative things. And then you also have solutions at much larger scale. This is, for example, here for carbon capture from the Japanese Pavilion. So you have small scale to large scale solutions. And then, of course, these are sometimes they're launched maybe in prototypes, not necessarily commercial yet. But they really kind of encourage discussion and collaboration and support, but then they're really a massive kind of undertaking. Then you have various initiatives. Here's an example of the Climate Mobility Pavilion with a focus on youth, which was really kind of increased this COP, but also other NGOs. And here you also have an example of IRENA. And then there are also various like side meetings, and the side meetings can again either be a discussion of different important topics. Sometimes they're policy, sometimes they're really creating awareness, and sometimes there are initiatives and agreements that are kind of really actually happening in these side events that then take place into the negotiations. And here is one example from the Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change, and the other one is an example on renewable energy and a side event in the Moroccan Pavilion in which I participated. And then finally, here we have an example of the global initiatives that were launched or been underway at COP29. This is a picture from what the COP29 had asked as the participants, and I'm not sure if you can read all of this. I'll highlight it kind of like in border the big important ones, but we have initiatives on finance, on trade and investment, on green energy, on hydrogen, on farmers, methane, tourism, even the peace initiatives, water, health cities, and others. Which one do you think was, hopefully not cheating, which one do you think was the one that got the most interest? Finance, exactly. And you can see that very, very clearly in the blue if you look kind of at the line over here. There's supposed to be a clicker. Oh, here we go. It's a bit faint, but you can see it. So finance was really where most of the visitors decided that this is where they want to kind of are most interested and want to support, which of course is important because it's an enabler for a lot of the policies, but then that also means that a lot of the other initiatives kind of fall behind and are not really as important. So I kind of said already that the biggest expectations have been on the climate finance, really coming out of COP28. So I'll walk you through briefly some of the main outcomes of COP28 negotiations. And mind you, these negotiations or the outcomes have come out of that very difficult, big process that I tried to just give you a glimpse of in the pictures that I shared with you. The first one is that we agreed on a new collective quantified goal, NCQG as it's known. We have a lot of acronyms in the climate world. And basically there it was agreed that there's a need for about $1.3 trillion of funds that are required to be delivered annually by 2035. And this decision is now called Baku to Benem. Benem is where the next COP will take place in Brazil. However, what was also agreed in terms of what will be committed now to be given out of the 1.3 billion is trillion, is 300 billion annually. And this is a tripling of the previous target that was agreed, which was 100 billion. Now, this is obviously tripling is quite big and quite important, but if you look at the amount that was agreed that was needed is obviously a massive shortcut over there. This also comes importantly at the right, kind of at the important time as countries need to submit their third round of mandatory submissions to the UNFCCC, which we call the NDCs or nationally determined contributions. Those are due now. My sources at the UNFCCC say those are mostly delayed with understanding and expectation, but these NDCs, which basically countries tell us what they're intending to, how much they're intending to reduce their emissions and how, and in which industries, et cetera, all depend on this finance. And this is clearly not enough in some way, because even the International Energy Agency has expected that global clean energy investments will be exceeding 2 trillion just in for the first time as a total of 2024. I don't think this number has been now that 2024 has ended, been updated, but clearly I think there's a big gap in terms of what the funding that is needed to meet the climate needs. And you see even within, I think, agreement within the parties that this was not enough. You see also particularly in the way that the decision was kind of agreed at the very last minute. A lot of developing countries felt that they were really squeezed into a corner when they were really tired after negotiations, and particularly small island developing states were really impacted and left quite unhappy because they're the most impacted by climate change, but also the African group of negotiators, AGNs, as well as the least developing countries. So this outcome wasn't satisfactory for everybody, as you would understand. Probably the second, I think maybe the biggest actually outcome and quote-unquote achievement of COP29 is really agreeing on what we know is Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. So this is really basically progress on carbon markets. And this is for the first time now, this article was operationalized, and this has been going on for negotiations that have lasted over a decade. So this is really quite an important achievement. And particularly maybe noting two important articles. One is on country-to-country trading, which is under Article 6.2. So this really supports, basically, there's more clarity in how countries now can basically trade carbon credits and then register tracking of the carbon trading mechanisms as well. And then also centralized carbon markets under Article 4, 6.4 was also agreed, and this was actually on the very first day. So why is this important? This is important because it could provide a source of funding for developing countries. I think it's also potentially very important for industries, for hard-to-abate sectors that find it also very difficult to decarbonize. There's been some estimates, this is from 2019, on potentially maybe carbon markets basically providing about 250 billion or so of funding annually. The number remains to be obviously to be agreed. And also the text finally had language on environmental integrity and transparency. But there are still shortcomings here because there are still indeed weak measurements on environmental integrity and accountability, and you really require for this to succeed, participants to really have trust in the system. And if you have no transparency measures and no trust, then obviously the result could be greenwashing. And a very important part of this is also that for this to also be successful, developing countries who could use this need support to kind of understand how they can really benefit from these markets. The other probably outcome that happened at COP29, which is both a success in a way, but also I think increases compliance requirements and burden for countries, is basically on enhanced transparent climate reporting. So there was agreed that there will be a biennial, so once every 2 years, transparency reports submitted by the countries, and the first one have been issued at COP29 with 13 countries in particular. If you're interested, they're here on the slide that have submitted by the end of COP29. Since then, this has increased. But basically, this has been something that also has been discussed before, and obviously transparency is a very important element of not only climate finance, but the whole climate process, as well as different policies and measurements. Now to the maybe less successful ones. So there was a gender climate action, which was quite important. And then I think indeed it's really important to adopt that because gender issues are really not only very important when it comes to climate change, but gender matters tend to be often ignored, to be honest. But this was basically agreed that they will work on it for the next 10 years, and there was no real kind of decision at the moment. This will be taken up in Bonn. The second one that I said was kind of a flow from COP29 is the Just Transition Working Group. And basically there was nothing on negotiations. And I'll talk about this a little bit later. Adaptation to climate change, which is how do we deal with how climate change happens rather than how do we reduce it. Also very limited progress. Loss and damage fund, very limited progress. Civil society participation from youth and children. I think this was a very positive area in the sense that there was acknowledgement and more availability, so to speak, or space for them. And there was the global climate action space that was there at COP29. So this was really important. But then the next step is taking their voices into the policy sphere, because at the moment they're not really fully represented and their work isn't as inclusive as it could be. Does COP29 a success or a failure, and does it matter and why? I guess this is the big question. And the answer is it's neither nor. I think obviously, as I hope I've showed you and gotten you to appreciate, there are indeed significant advancements, but they're still not enough. But what I would like to take you now with the next bit of this talk on the challenges is part of the success or / failure is really due to just limitation of the process itself. So even if you have a stronger presidency, for example, you're still not going to necessarily be able to get all these parties to achieve on something where you have competing priorities, where you have parties waiting on the other to act, and then obviously you have also responsible parties versus impacted parties. The situation is really complex, which I'll show you in a bit. But it is really this limitations of the COP that make it really basically have limits to how much we can achieve through this process. And this matters because Benin, the Brazilian presidency, really the COP30 was supposed to be the big COP where a lot of things are going to be improved and happening. And, the talk is we're not going to bring COP to Belém, we're going to bring, the other way around, we're not going to bring, we're going to basically, the idea is to bring all of even the COP process a bit more into really what's happening in Brazil, even from a biological, like natural perspective, to see what is, I shouldn't speak on behalf of the Brazilians, but basically to have even the COP itself look a little bit different rather than really more in a nature-based place. And of course, this is going to be very difficult, but the idea with that is we are really going to have now big action. I think whatever happens at COP29 might undermine what will happen at COP30 and make it a lot more difficult for us to move forward. If you're still doubting climate change, and hopefully you're not, I encourage you to go and read more information on that and why then it matters, because I don't have time to cover it here, and why it matters that then there is some progress and achievement on mitigating climate change. So why I did talk to you a little bit before in at the end of the last slide that there are basically it's neither a success nor a failure because of the limitations of the global climate regime itself, which really puts significant limits on how much can be achieved through this process. One of the main, I want to walk you through a bit of these limitations, and I think they're more than just limitations, they're limitations, but also I want to combine that with where we are today in the world in a global geopolitical perspective as well. The first maybe element of these limitations really comes from the dynamics between the global north and the global south. And there are indeed huge power imbalances. So you have the global north, and I know this terminology can be questionable and sometimes debated by people, but just for simplicity, we're going to use it. So advanced rich economies have not only caused climate change historically, but also have the funds, have the money, and also they tend to have massive power imbalances, not only in what they bring to the table, but also in negotiations. And then you see that also in the tactics that are being played in the negotiations, and also you see it in the commitments that are being presented. And I won't talk a lot about that in terms of really why some of this can be really the positions that global north countries are taking vis-a-vis the global south countries can sometimes be quite hypocritical, in my opinion. There's a piece that I wrote right before COP28 that the title of which is on the board, the slide, that I welcome you to go read and get a bit more details on that. But basically, the narrative has been happening really as we accept for the global north what we don't accept for the global south. So we criticize the UAE and Azerbaijan for being fossil fuel producers, but we don't criticize Glasgow in Scotland for, or even, the Netherlands historically, which is also a fossil fuel producer when they had their COPs. So we see double standards here. The other double standard is we, again, call for, we being the global north, in climate negotiation request that no more investments in fossil fuels, for example, in developing countries take place, including by fossil fuel producers. But then if you look at the United States, even before withdrawing from the from Paris Agreement, which comes to the next point that I'll be talking about later, obviously emissions and fossil fuel production has been rising. So there's this double standard, and this double standard then also really happens in the negotiations themselves. And here's an example that I witnessed myself. This is from the Just Transition Work Program that I mentioned to you earlier, where there was a deadlock. You see on the slide, the person who's speaking is the representative of the bloc of the G77 and China, which has about 134 developing countries in it. The way the negotiations take place, not only between countries, but also blocks. So you have the African group that can be a bloc, the Latin American countries can be a bloc, the African a group of African countries as well can be a bloc, and then you have the G77 and China, also another bloc. There was a request from this group to give them a bit extra time to read the text, to negotiate on the text. They were coming with requests to really have genuine negotiations. And the number of times that they were shut down by negotiators of advanced economies was just really mind-boggling. They did not want to give them just extra time for the next day to give time for them to review the text and then come up with solutions. And then there were also negotiation tactics that were implemented. And when it came to the climate finance situation, for example, the 1.3 billion trillion that I mentioned earlier, what we heard from the negotiators is that basically they were exhausted, they were tired, they got the text very last minute from a lot of the co-chairs of these committees, and developing countries tend to have smaller negotiation group teams. So the same people are covering multiple portfolios, while richer economies might have bigger teams covering less portfolios. So you have exhausted people who have to be making decisions at the end, and the clock is ticking. And these negotiations then and these dynamics, I think, really undermine the process, particularly when we talk about quote unquote a just transition. And this, of course, comes with the fact that it was really the advanced economies that caused climate change historically. So this is data that I am representing for you kind of over time from the mid 18th century to 2023, showing that the US alone basically contributed about a quarter of the world's emissions, EU about 17%, China is about 15%, and then it jumps to less, about half of that, Russia, UK, Japan, and India. Then the rest are all below. And then there's been some interesting work that's been presented by, the sources are on the page for you, but work by Jones et al. And Landwall and others. And then this graph is from Carbon Briefing that basically shows that if you consider a colonial rule, then particularly the emissions for European countries will rise even more. And the global south, or countries, developing countries, and negotiations are very aware of this fact, even if they don't always know the figures. And this comes in the negotiations as they request additional funding and support from the global north, who is then not giving it to them. And I grabbed kind of together just the value of what the emissions of the biggest 20 economies, the group of 20, we're looking, and this of course includes EU, 84% of global emissions come from them, compared with 1% of low-income countries. So there's massive challenge. What complicates this picture is that these low-income countries and the island economies are really the ones who are really the most impacted by climate change, even though they didn't kind of achieve it or cause it. And then, of course, you have different industries having contributed to that. There's aviation, there's shipping, there's cement, there's aluminum. Fossil fuel industries are evidently the largest culprit here in terms of contribution to emissions. The second thing that I think is a main limitation of the international climate regime beyond the dynamics of the countries really has to do with the fact that there is a voluntary action. It's really difficult to enforce the agreed measures. And this is something that's obviously good and important as part of the UN system, but also creates a problem then because it's very difficult to hold countries accountable. And this is an example where I think is really interesting, the common but differentiated responsibilities principle in the Paris Agreement, upon which a lot of the requests of the climate of the global south are actually resting. But then even there are kind of disagreements between the global north and the global south on that. And then even within the international climate system that we have now, there's committed technical and technology support that has been given and often very required and called for by developing countries as well from the global north and from investors that are large multinationals as well. But in my opinion, this has often failed. We just see it. In most cases, it fails. There's no real support for that. And then there's also, we really need to rethink what it means to really give technical support there. And all of this obviously is finance dependent. So if you don't have enough finance, we're not going to be able to enable a lot of these. I'm going to go a little bit fast on the next challenges, just to give you an idea, but because I'd like to leave some time for discussion and Q&A, but happy to discuss this afterwards if you will. The other challenge in the system as we have it today is we really want to advance energy transition projects and climate change mitigation and adaptation, but developing countries in particular have massive developmental, policy, and procedural challenges. So it is really difficult for them. And some of the challenges really come from the fact that energy transition projects and mitigation have costs, real actual trade-offs when it comes to the economy. Some of you in advanced economies here in the UK probably even know that this is true for us here as well. But the other complication there is that they're also impacted by policies that the global north will take. So you have unilateral measure like CBAM in Europe, for example, developing countries, even if they don't have to pay it, their industries are still impacted. And I have done some work showing the effects of these cross-border effects that I'll be happy to talk about afterwards. And then, of course, the big thing is very limited fiscal space for them, as well as you have developmental challenges. Energy poverty is real. You have in Africa by itself 600 million people. I think I pressed the wrong thing. 600 million people who still live without electricity. And then a lot of them have debt. And finally, it is very difficult for them to get financing. And a lot of financing, the investors are looking really not so much on the development need, but on where would they be able to get return on their investment. And this is an example, this leads me to my next difficulty, which is even if you commit now 300 instead of $100 billion, are we really able to get those funds? And are those funds then really meaningful? And this is work that's been done by Oxfam showing that out of up until average of 2020, where is my, okay, here. I apologize, I'm looking for the marker, I can't find it. It's going there, okay. The big purple and orange column at the 2019-20 average bar, that bar basically is the amount that companies have reported as the funding that they have given out of the 100 billion target, which is approximately 82 billion. But a lot of that came in loans, and those loans then are also then basically crippling already indebted economies. And according to Oxfam, about the last blue column you see on the screen, about only 23.5 billion of that, if you take appropriate reporting, is actually going to add value and is genuine climate finance. So then how do we then make sure that we can get this funding in the next bit of commitments? It's going to be more difficult, particularly given some of the challenges that I'm going to mention to you in a little bit. The next thing, of course, is the fact that we need fossil fuel producers. As long as there are fossil fuel producers producing, we will always consume, right? This is in a nutshell what it is. And then the challenge here is that it is really difficult for fossil fuel producers to transition for very different ways. It's expensive. A lot of their economies depend on them. And also when they see, advanced economies also expanding their production, there's really no incentives there to expand that. But also some countries, Senegal is one of them, who really believes that it is their right from a just transition to develop fossil fuel economies, just as other countries have developed over time, using resources of other poor economies, as we've mentioned. So how much and how do we transition away, particularly in a fossil fuel producer or fossil fuel rich economy, remains an issue. And then the issues of just transition, even for because sometimes and you see this also in the US, for example, in India, the workers in the fossil fuel industry are going to be very impacted. So we have when you have economies and countries that you have voting, for example, their voices really matter. So these also complicate the picture. Moving on a little bit to some of the global dynamics that are really making this a lot more difficult. I think you recognize the picture in the caricature here. If not, I hope you do. It is the new US President Trump. And this basically shows you not only that he is withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement, but also the denial that he brings when it comes to the science about climate change. This picture actually is from 2018, from the first time that he withdrew, not now. And it's interesting that one could argue, well, nothing happened then, but why would it matter now? And actually, the circumstances are different, both globally, but also when it comes to the emissions as well, and the rise of the temperature that we really critically now need to address. I want to give you a contrast by how it was right before Trump came into power. The previous administration, and I'm not a fan of either, so I just have to put that out there. There's no political positioning here. But the previous Biden administration, before they left, basically said that they could reduce emissions by up to 60% by by over 60% by 2030. And then a month later, when Trump was in office, he signed an executive order literally called Putting America First in International Environmental Agreements, after which he withdrew from the Paris Agreement. And of course, there's a lot of funding for projects in the US that also will be impacted. Now, this not only gives a signal to other countries and other producers that they no longer need to care about the climate, but it also really puts a question, particularly because there have been other tariff and other economic policies and other tax uncertainties that have been happening in the US. It puts a question on already committed investments when it comes to green energy. I couldn't have asked for better timing. This is unfortunate news, but it works really well for the timing of this presentation. This is from today's Financial Times, showing the CEO of the major French energy NG, basically warning that they'll be freezing basically investments in green energy in line of the uncertainty that's taking place in the US. BP just yesterday as well basically said that they will slash investments in renewables and return to oil and gas. And the wording that I put for you here in red is misplaced faith in green energy. How do you misplace faith in a month, right? So this is obviously very political. This is very much also market signals, and the investments that are increasing in oil and gas are about 20% that they're committing. I think this is just the beginning, right? And many will follow, even if they don't necessarily announce. And also within this is very, very, very much limited, related, I think, to the economy. And I borrowed here something from the US. It's the economy, stupid. The economic situation in the countries that are supposed to pay the climate finance is bad and deteriorating. And this coincides with the rise of the far right and fascism. And my dear friend Suzanne Schneider is an expert on this, and she happens to be here in the room as well. You combine that with the US policies on climate change, and what do we have? We end up with even a more strained fiscal space in advanced economies. And then also the case for supporting aid and development funding goes down increasingly. Forget about green industrial policies. This is particularly in the European case, where there is this dream of protecting jobs and industries and remaining competitive and also maintaining everything green. Very, very difficult to have these targets together. And then you have increasing financial priorities at home. And we see this already happening. If you haven't watched the news from yesterday, where the Prime Minister, the UK Prime Minister basically decreasing funding to increase defense spending. So these trends are happening, and in some instances, we don't even know about them. I mean, these are democracies that announce this. In other countries, what happens in budgets in already shrinking fiscal spaces isn't necessarily being shown. So with all of this, I think if you put it all together between the dynamics that are happening globally, the challenges within countries themselves, both advanced and developing, as well as the limitations of the COP process. If you add all of these things together, I think we're looking at a very grim future when it comes to climate commitments. It's very difficult now to see how we can get ourselves out of this. And my personal belief, as well as this is kind of supported by the science as well, is the need really between now and 2030 to have a lot of those investments. If we don't have things in place in 2030, we're really behind, and we're already behind target. So maybe we won't achieve 1.5, but maybe something close to it. I think where we're looking at now is something that's going to be significantly worse at all levels. And then, of course, to add to that, the concerns over wars, of course, that are happening, increased competition over critical minerals in different countries. The picture just goes on and on and on. Unfortunately, being the bearer of the bad news here, which is maybe the writings on the wall that a lot of you are seeing, I think the Belém or the COP30 presidency is going to have a very difficult challenge. But also countries, I think we need to maybe have reliance less on the process, but maybe more take this as an internal policy decision and say, what can we as individuals, as governments, and as corporations do to overcome some of these challenges? And now I move to kind of the final bit of which are solutions that I think will be needed if you want to have effective and just climate action. Obviously, I've said this at the beginning, we need to think of ways that we go beyond the limitations of the process. But this all requires real political will. So you need leaders, and if they're not in policy, then you need them in academia, where we are now. You need them in, think tanks and NGOs. You need them in corporations to think, also have the political will. And I mean the political, not necessarily from a large government level, but any political policy will to make and bring about these changes. The first thing I think we need to, all of us, particularly policymakers, we consider is how we think. How we think of of transitioning away from fossil fuel. We think of it as a cost, and we need to start thinking more and more, what's the cost of not doing it, which there aren't really actual genuine discussions on that. And we need to combine that as an opportunity to also then have not only clean development and clean industries, but also a source of jobs, a source of development. If we can kind of leverage trade and investment policies and local policies across different industries to bring about this rethinking, I think this is going to be extremely important. And it's not just going to be carbon tax, it has to be a suite of different policies together. And then again, we need to rethink of the long-term cost, not only the short-term cost. And it's extremely important to have policies that are integrative, because unfortunately, I haven't seen, that's not true. I've seen some better than others, but most countries basically have silos and operate in silos when it comes to their climate and energy and economic policies. There should be then, of course, an integration of things like jobs. What is the implications of industrial policy on jobs, on growth, on gender issues, and what are the just transition issues there? And I've talked a bit about the just transition from a developing country perspective, but this is also very much a developed country perspective issue. You see it in the US, you see it in the UK, you see it in Norway, and other G20 countries like South Africa, etc. And part of, yeah, I'm going to move on from that. The second solution, I think, is we need to think of how we can improve economic conditions in countries without really just transitioning or adding additional costs for just transition. And this happens with economic reform. And this is an example of work that I've done quite a few years back on how we can improve the economic resilience of a rich fossil fuel producer. Here is the example of Kuwait, whereby if we implement energy policy reform, and then with the dynamics of oil and gas pricing internationally, there's really negative effects on the economy. But if you combine that with microeconomic reform, the economy is all of a sudden significantly better. And those are the kind of policies that we need to think, how can we improve the economy without necessarily changing the structure? On finance, there needs to be more concessional to grants rather than things that increase the indebtedness of developing countries. The base of contributors need to expand not only to new countries, and there has been some signs of that at COP29, like China and other economies. That is important, but I think we need to, in the civil society wording, hold fossil fuel producers accountable. And I think there needs to be a shift away from the voluntary nature of all of this, a little bit more something that's mandatory within the policy sphere, and really having, call it tax or some sort, basically a levy on fossil fuel producers. They will argue that this will slash their investments, but their rents are really, really massive. And I think that is really, they are the contributor for climate change, and that's going to be really important. And this is particularly important in rich economies where the taxpayer does not really want to support another country in Africa, right, for their climate change. So why not actually go to the source of the problem? And then from there, I want to combine that with maybe also thinking of this, instead of saying developing countries, that actually point number 5, it's a typo, it should have said developed advanced economies. When countries are thinking of where Germany, for instance, where should it invest in Africa to expand its green hydrogen production, or how would the European Union or other countries transition away, there needs to be just transition considerations of developing countries there, which at the moment are not necessarily taking place. Next to that is really, I think, policies. I've mentioned already, there's silos in policymaking, both across advanced and developing countries. I think we need to start shifting away, and really, again, if countries are genuine policymakers, I need to start thinking of genuine, coherent policies that combine advancements on the economy, but also other socioeconomic targets with a greener outlook as well. The next thing is, this is something, the background of which I didn't really talk much about, other than the fact that capacity building is failing. Developing countries need access to not just support, but they need really accessible and genuine and affordable technical and technology support. And as I mentioned, I think this has been failing from my perspective. There is some support out there. Countries need to define what support they need, but I think this is going to be extremely critical going forward, particularly if we're thinking in a less lucrative climate finance space. The next thing I think number 8 is really kind of enhancing, again, going beyond the focus of the COP. What can different organizations do beyond the COP? What can different roles of civil society have? And the next thing I want to talk about very briefly, the last point, number 9, probably deserves half a session by itself, but basically the role and importance of carbon capture technologies. Those are going to be extremely important here as well. But these are not enough necessarily, right? So that is going to be extremely important going forward. Actually, I have it more here on point number 7. The numbering is a bit off. But here, basically, the point here with the carbon technologies is oil and gas, whether you like it or not, isn't going away. How can we make it cleaner for the environment? And I think one important thing will have to be in ensuring that the rise of the price that comes from the technology is not transferred onto the consumer, which is very difficult, but can be done through policy and political will. And finally, is there really now a role with the US being out and the EU kind of changing its role on leading role in the climate? Can we think of other countries that might step up to kind of, and rise up to the opportunity and have more of a leading role on this? Obviously, there's expectations on China. What would the role of the EU be? Those remain to be important questions. And the final point that I want to, I think is going to be increasingly important is countries that are within the same region that have the similar challenges and infrastructure and sometimes maybe fiscal space or even industries. We need to see more of them working together and coming up with solutions and really kind of bypassing really the climate space. And I'll give one example here very briefly of there's some island economies, for example, that Vanuatu is one that basically believes that they're really under threat of the climate, whether they get financed or not, they're acting. I think this is really more of a little bit of the framing that we need to take as well. Not that we don't need climate and we shouldn't hold the culprits accountable, but we really need to kind of step up and take additional action if we really believe that that's important. And that's all I have for you. It was quite a large overview. And I hope to engage you in some Q&A from online and the group in the room.
Thanks, Manal, for your first INET seminar. Really appreciate it. Open it up for questions.
Yeah.
I have a little bit of bias because I work on labor markets, but
Yeah.
I was wondering, how are the discussions there around the impact on jobs? So the transition will have implications for jobs in the developed countries and in the developing, and as well as the climate impacts directly, right? Like, so, effects on agriculture, where a large number of developing countries are dependent on those sectors. So are there any policy discussions that have thought more deeply on the jobs issue, or?
It's a very important question. Labor now often comes under this idea of just transition, right? I think the discussion varies from country to country and region to region. One very interesting thing that happened to me in the Bonn climate meeting, I was presenting on just transition to the parties, and there was I guess, disagreement, if you will, from some of the civil society organizations who believe that the labor market and just transition focus and policies should be focused only on unions. And that, of course, is something I completely disagree with, particularly in the context of developing countries where most labor are not registered. And forget women, they're not even in the system whatsoever. So you're ignoring more than half of the population. But that discussion has actually been really relevant very much from before being at the international climate level. In the US, for example, the unions have really been talking about this idea of a just transition from a labor perspective. And then the ILO, for example, kind of jumping now to today, the ILO has also been supporting a lot of this work on jobs. I think the focus often has been on jobs of those impacted in the transition, mostly from fossil fuel industry. There's been less talk on what about other industries that are going to be less impacted. And again, this is it varies from place to place and from skill to skill, because if you look at those impacted with petroleum engineering degrees, this is very different from unskilled coal workers, right? And there's a case of South Africa where it shows, women who work there when they transitioned were actually very negatively impacted. So there really needs to be a lot of policies on labor, but those policies, I think, have to be very specific to the nature of the place. The other thing that I could show you, because I have a page on this. One thing that hasn't been very much talked about, I very briefly talked about it, those indirect cross-border effect. This is an example, and I completely coincidentally included it here. This is an example of basically if we implement a carbon tax in Europe, for example, what would it do to workers and labor in developing countries that aren't exposed to that? And you mentioned farming. This is example from household incomes in Kenya. And we see here that even though just through trade dynamics, the labor market is going to be affected because they obviously export, right, or import. So there are indirect effects also that are going to be very important at play. These tend to be in the climate negotiation talk under the response measures, cross-border effects. There aren't as discussed as much. And actually developing countries often want to bring those to the table. Advanced economies often want to say, take it off of the table. But it's a very important part of the puzzle, 100%. And of course, when it comes to voting, people's jobs are the first thing that, lead them to kind of vote in a certain way.
Thanks for your talk. I'm a master's student studying social policies. I'm quite interested in the overlap between social policy and climate change adaptation policies.
Yeah.
I've obviously never attended a COP, and I was just curious, who is involved, and do you see, this being multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, or social policy researchers involved in these talks, specifically on just transition issues? Because I noted with COP29, there's talk about, having a holistic transition that also looks at health inequalities or other inequalities, and yet there's a lack of research on that, or lack of existing policies. So it's something I'm interested in looking at in my thesis as well.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic question. You're absolutely right that this is an interdisciplinary area, and I think I can speak from my personal research on this, and I think one of the reasons that I've been able to communicate a lot of this research at the policy space, at the COP space, was the fact that even though I'm coming from a particular method, which in my case is economics, it does include a bit more interdisciplinarity to it. So you take whether it's political economy, technology, or others. The thing about social policy that you mentioned, I think I did say there are silos in how policies are being made. And I think this is really the space for social policy to address, because climate change is affecting health, education, it's affecting the cost of delivering services, it's affecting economies. If you look at places where there are disasters, you're also having massive things there. So already without really any of these policies, just the fact that there is climate change, it's often presenting a cost to policymakers. And then you add that, as you said, there aren't always enough research. I think there is slightly an increased appreciation of the fact that this is multidisciplinary area, and that there needs to be kind of discussion, so to speak, with the different aspects and different speakers. But I think to answer your question, who comes here? It's often negotiators. Some of the and then you have negotiators are formal negotiators. You can also have NGOs, as I mentioned in the pictures. You also have civil society organizations, and a little bit, but not as maybe one would think, some academics and research organizations. I think if we can link more research to the social policy space, where you have the interdisciplinarity of these areas, I think this will be extremely important in advancing development and reducing inequality and really addressing indirectly climate change, but also direct effects of it, if you know what I mean. Do you have time? I think 2 more questions. Suzanne, Susie, and Eric.
So I'm gonna ask the provocative question. You said that 1.5, degrees Celsius might be dead, but from your presentation, I have to wonder, is actually COP dead? Is this entire institutional edifice that was at the international levels, a kind of relic of an international world order, which we see slipping away and kind of crumbling before us, that is really in shambles, that has shown itself completely unable to do anything we wanted to do, either on the front of war and genocide to climate. Like, what do we gain by pretending that this thing works and that it can do what we need it to do? And if we're ready to have that conversation and then say, like, well, what actually are the alternatives? Are there other institutions? I mean, my country is like a rogue nation at this point, so don't look to us. But
He's
like,
American for those who can't tell.
but I just, as you know, like, I just think we have to be very clear about, as you rightly said, these kind of limitations, but then I'm just left wondering, well, then why should we expect anything to come from this set of institutional arrangements at all? Is it not better for us to start thinking in terms of alternatives?
We need to think of alternatives, and I hope I convinced you that we really need to think of alternatives. Some might argue, as you said, that maybe the COP process is dead. But I also want to challenge you again and say the world doesn't stop at the US. So if the US is no longer there, there is still the majority of the rest of the world that has representation and should be representative. And if Trump asks the US to leave, and of course it's going to have ripple effects on lots of other countries and their policies and their positions, I think there's also literally the rest of the world that is there. I think it is extremely important, maybe there's a lot of processes within the COP that have failed. And this is a separate discussion of is multilateralism dead? I think on issues of genocides and war, I think it has met epic fail there. I think on the climate, despite all the challenges I've mentioned, I still think there are indeed a lot of progress and possibilities. And, the UNFCCC team works really, really, really very hard. And I know these people to really advance a lot of this, the work, the effort that they're doing. There are also a lot of countries that truly, genuinely are impacted by climate change and really are very invested in the support of this process. And a lot of initiatives, very good initiatives, very positive investments, very good policy changes that have come out of a lot of the different initiatives and I've showed you how different things happen at the COP. It's not just a bit of the negotiations in that room. So while I do agree with you that it is very, we need to think of alternatives and this is very critical and maybe in shambles, as you said, but I do not think we should give up on the idea or on the fact that we need to try to aim for 1.5 and to try to reach as much as possible of it. That said, I think what we global actors, what we do between now and 2030 is going to be really, really very critical. I think at the last climate meeting in Bonn last June, I left feeling very discouraged, let's just say, really very, very discouraged. And I really think if we don't up some of the processes, if we don't up some of the commitments and really increase the negotiations, the just transition was one of them. Climate is another. Technology transfer, I didn't even get to really talk much about that. Gender issues, I didn't talk much about that. I think those between now and 2030, what we do and how we act is going to be very critical. But the world, as I said, does not just depend on the US, and it's not only on governments. And this is what I'm also hoping that you got out of this talk. There are other groups that we also have, I think, have a role in this, and there is momentum we should, and I hope we can capitalize on. Eric.
I'm gonna try and leave us on a slightly more optimistic.
Yes, she's I'm like the end of a more of a positive thing.
Well, first to your excellent question, I'm from the Rogue Nation as well. I've been involved in COPs over many, many years, and the COP has been dead for at least 20 or 30 years, yet occasionally it produces actually quite useful things. So it's a horrible process. I mean, you would not design a process this way, and it's painful to sit through these meetings and so on. But occasionally, it moves the needle in some positive ways. Paris really did change the conversation, change the way countries behave in this, and that came on the heels of the collapse in Copenhagen.
Correct.
Even in this awful geopolitical environment, things like the global stock taking is going to be a useful snapshot of where we are. The COPs are also once a year, the whole media focuses around the world on the climate issue. That in itself is useful. It's also a space where, people like Manal and lots of NGOs and academics actually get together and have, very productive discussions, even if the politicians are all being idiots. Would I want to reform it and change it? Absolutely. Would I want to, make it disappear? No, I think it still has a role. But more generally, I think that the reaction to Trump has been, at least in this sphere, overblown. I think in other spheres, yes, we should be, very worried. Myself and Joan Farmer actually have a piece coming out Saturday in the Wall Street Journal arguing that, there's a lot of noise going on around Trump and climate, but what he can actually do and his ability to do anything is much more limited. So he can't change the fundamental economics and technologies of clean energy. That horse has already left the barn. The IEA had a big report just the other week that solar plus batteries is now basically cheaper than anything else in the world. And and even his ability to change the situation in the US is limited. The main part of the IRA is tax credits, and it takes legislation to repeal those. He doesn't have the votes in Congress to do it. So, there'll be a lot of noise and angst about it, but if you look at in his last term, the growth in renewables in the US just continued sailing right through his 4 years to even move.
Yeah.
So that's, it's awful in lots of ways, but we shouldn't overreact. And then also, countries are going to be tight on fiscal space to do a lot of this stuff, but there's a lot of stuff that actually doesn't need fiscal support. It needs other kinds of support. So because the economics are improving, a lot of what governments need to do is kind of just help remove all the bottlenecks and enable, get the grids opened up and there is some investment needed in grids, but changing regulations, a lot of actually quite simple stuff would make a big difference, including in developing countries. And I think, the big thing where we are going to lose out, which you touched on, is just, the view on aid. It's been, that's been a disaster, for years with the US pulling out. That's not going to make it better. I think that will have a particularly negative impact on adaptation, where huge amounts of, much more sort of traditional aid style support is needed. I think on clean energy transition in developing countries, again, if we're smart about it, we can get to a more optimistic story, even in a fiscally limited space.
Yeah, I don't share the same optimism with you on investments in clean energy in developing countries just yet. Because while indeed the pricing for it, you just mentioned renewable and batteries, but then you need the investment to put it in. So the physical, the capital expenditure is obviously big. After that, obviously, the operative expenditures are a lot less. But then and this is, I think, where particularly in areas where there is energy poverty, we see more investments because it's cheaper to invest in fossil fuels. We really need to rethink that, right? And this is where, the problem with the climate finance and the graph, if you remember, of the 100 billion, there is the main mismatch between the investor and those who need it is the investor is still looking at where can I make the most return of my investment. It's obviously not social entrepreneurship, but because of the biggest investment there, a lot of these countries, on paper at least, look very risky. So there is a mismatch of where do you bring the funds. So I think there in developing countries, I think the question, in theory, yes, we should be able to mobilize all this funding. I think in reality, it is very, very difficult, particularly if it goes into the loan perspective. And then, but you mentioned something which was regulation, and I was quite light on mentioning it here on purpose. I kind of mentioned the first point is we really need to rethink kind of our integrative policies, and those, part of that, because it's integrative by nature, a lot of that has to do with the regulation. And I think market dynamics, when there's money, renewables will continue going, whether Trump is in office or not. I think that is definitely a reality. But I think what we're seeing here, and this is what will be interesting to see, is the extent to which we will have more BPs kind of announcing globally they will slash renewables, right? And I think whether other countries also will, fossil fuel producers in particular, who are kind of happy to join the just transition, the energy transition kind of train, as long as they can still produce clean oil through carbon capture, et cetera, whether that's still going to be important. And in that space, I kind of mentioned we need to support it, but it's not enough. The regulation there is going to be extremely critical when it comes to also regulating industries in general. But I think for that to happen, it still has to be part of a larger view of how can we, it's not just an economic question, right, in the immediate term. Because sometimes the immediate economics don't make sense. And if you take the long picture, the economics are fully with you. And I repeat, we need to start rethinking or kind of communicating the cost of not really adopting clean energies. Because at the moment, we're like, what is it gonna cost me? How much is it gonna raise my bill? We need to think, how much is costing me of actually continuing this and not adopting? And regulation, when I said we need to move away from the voluntary, I think it really goes exactly to your point on regulation, because then that can be real policy, and doesn't matter what Trump is doing, doesn't matter how dead or not dead the COP is, but then there's a political will, and as long as that political will is there, I think that's what's going to be really critical.
Yeah, I think digging into why isn't the capital for economically positive projects flowing into these countries, because when you do start to dig in, you find that each country in case is quite different.
Absolutely.
Why isn't it flowing into South Africa? There's a set of very specific conditions.
Or Mauritania, or
India. And that's actually something I'd love to see us do some more work on, because I think, being able to unlock those flows of capital, and governments are going to have to play a role, but a lot of it will have to be private sector capital, is going to be key, making the positive economics actually work in the near term.
Right, I agree, and I think also a critical part of that has to come also with more involvement from the host country. So often when there's a proposed investment project in India or South Africa or Mauritania or wherever, usually the investor is also coming with their studies of the feasibility study, environmental impact study, et cetera, with little engagement of what does it then mean to that recipient. And I think that engagement hopefully will be part of a better, of an important discussion, because then it could also require improvements in, for example, the business environment that would then really generate more FDI, for example. But I think how much of that is also going to be, this is coming, maybe I can present again to you, not the investor's view, but the developing recipient country view. There's often also the view that some of this, particularly when it comes to critical minerals, hydrogen, et cetera, not just renewable energy projects or whatever, there is maybe an exploitative nature of that. And you might have heard even terms of, green colonialism come up again. That is very much associated with these things. So I think it's a very important thing to consider why it's flowing and where, but how can you then make those flows really a win-win for both, I think is going to be really the very important message for both the investor and also the recipient, and hopefully then the world as we live in it. Yeah.
Slightly more optimistic place.
Yes, we have to be more